Hello.
How goes it?
It's going well.
Lovely. So this week we are looking at Piero della Francesca, his painting The Baptism of Christ, which is in the National Gallery in London. And for this, I have looked, for this week's episode's research, I found a website called Travelling in Tuscany, which does not sound like a mecca for art history information, but in fact it is. It's a really impressive collection of essays, overviews of artists, and like really in-depth notes on paintings. I found a press release on Piero della Francesca in America, a different collection, so I found that quite useful. Personal Encounters by Keith Christensen, that was really useful, and Marco Grassi for an online publication, maybe also in print, for New Criterion, and it was called The World Knew Him Not. That was a really good read, Marco Grassi. I also came across a Rachel White-Reed article written or published with Gagosian, so there's a lot of writing out there on Piero della Francesca, but actually not an awful lot known about him. Like, his private life is quite private, and he sort of slipped off into obscurity quite soon. Towards the end of his life, so in short, the research on him is quite light, I would say, and I sort of thought I'd lightly touch on some of the biographic stuff and sort of have a bit more of a look at the paintings and think more broadly about his paintings and the influence of his paintings on this day and age. So I'll pull up the painting of the Baptism of Christ for you to have a look at and describe. There we go, that one.
Oh, the Baptism of Christ. I know it well. This takes me back to A-level art history.
I'm not sensing a terrible lot of enthusiasm.
I think I always have an issue when I'm presented with paintings in a mathematical manner.
Mm-hmm.
And this was used as an essay on the golden ratio or the golden perspective. Or...
Can you refresh my memory on the golden ratio?
Mate, I was 16. I can't say I was...
Shapes, forms...
It's the way that the painting is, the space is divided up and the amount of space each thing takes up. It's something to do with how that dove is is sectioning off the top of the painting from the bottom of the painting, and where the Christ is positioned, the distance from the dove and from the ground and all these things. It's something... But then I've seen the golden ratio referred to in paintings that look absolutely nothing like this one, so
yeah, of course. It's
definitely something I need to recap, because it's been, I'm not going to say how many years, but it's been a long time. Anyway, to describe this painting, it's an odd shape, so I can only assume it had a funky frame or it was designed for a specific space, because it's got a large semicircle on top of the work, and then it's basically a square underneath. It's a semicircle mounted on a square, with the scene of Christ being baptised by John the Baptist and other baptisms going on in the background. 3 women to the left, one of them definitely an angel. Don't know about the other 2.
They're all angels.
They're all angels. Can only see wings on one, hence my confusion.
Yeah.
A lovely sort of Tuscan landscape in the background. Looks like olive trees and that kind of dry hillside that you see in Tuscany, with the river running through the middle where Christ is being baptised, and he's sort of an almost sort of white sculptural figure, feels like marble, in the centre. And it's that usual, it's John the Baptist if he's wearing fur. There's such an interesting sort of sidebar, isn't it? Like how to identify the different saints and their... But John the Baptist is like the first one. I was like, well, I can handle that. That's an easy one to remember. But anyway, Baptist, baptising, fairly obvious. With a dove above his head. And a white tree to the left of the Christ. It's quite a pale painting. The colours aren't very vibrant because it's tempera. So the black is quite strong and the white is quite strong, and over time we don't know, and obviously I don't know what the colours were like on the initial painting of it, but only really the reds, blues are really vibrant, and then the green has dulled somewhat to quite sort of bottle green rather than a fresh outdoorsy green. And but John the Baptist is looking quite green himself.
Is he? Yeah, he is.
He is in the chest.
Yeah, you're right. Yeah, I think that's interesting that he is looking quite green because, as you said, it's all made in tempera, but with oil painting, underpainting of figures would have been in green for the flesh tones to sit on top of. So that's quite interesting.
Maybe that's a deterioration thing then.
It probably is, but also like with tempera, like that wouldn't have been part of the process. It would have just been like So it's interesting. I need to. I want to look into that. I want to look into the history of that, of like the conservation history and stuff. And
I know green is a very problematic colour in conservation history. There's a lot of Italian inks, I think ink specifically, or like watercolour paintings that were green and now blue. Some really surreal landscapes that are blue. Like blue hills, blue trees.
But just blue trees, blue hills. That makes me think of Joachim Patton there, who's in. There's a bunch of his paintings in the Prado. He's a sort of like flatland, Neverlandish painter, I think 16th century. But I sort of like have him bracketed as the sort of like first sort of almost modern monochromatic painter. Like he painted these sort of like really blue, lush blue, Prussian blue.
He's when we were talking about him in our Rubens episode, because he pioneered that brown foreground, green middle ground, blue background. So he did have a lot of solid blue in the back. But I don't know if he pioneered it or if he was it might be someone before him, but he definitely came up as one of the early players and the people that line of Rubens referring back to in his own landscape works. But that might be the blue that you're thinking of.
I think it is, I think it is, and it's also like it's interesting that like that the whole idea of like a monochrome is like fairly contemporary, very modern, because it just wasn't an interest in the past. I guess it's just not naturalistic, so it's a strange idea. So yeah, this work, Baptism of Christ by Piero della Francesca. Piero was born in 1415. Suspected between 1415 and 1420, and died around 1492. So he born in Tuscany, Tuscan, and I think it was San Sepolcro. Is that right? My notes on this one are a bit chaotic as well. Actually, it's good to just realise that right now.
San Sepolcro rings a bell. I don't know if that's a place or a church though.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think it is the town. Anyway, I'll just go through the notes. So, so this painting, the Baptism of Christ, was made for the Church of San Giovanni Battista in Val d'Afra in Piero's hometown of Borgo San Sepolcro. So it wasn't a million miles off. And this painting...
Borgo just means village.
Yes. So San Sepolcro, I wasn't...
You are correct.
I thought I took a wrong turn there for a second. But this is the earliest surviving work by Piero, and very few of his works in general survive. I think there's only 22 paintings of his, like standalone paintings, that survive, and there's a bunch of frescoes, but I'll get into that. We'll come back around to that. There may be some repeats in my research as well, because it's a bit all over the place. But alongside the painting, he was a mathematician and a geometer, and these other interests very much fed into the painting. He is most famous for his series of frescoes, the history of the True Cross in the Church of San Francesco in the Tuscan town of Arezzo, which was made in 1462. It seems that he was probably apprenticed to a local painter, Antonio di Giovanni, maybe D'Angieri, probably butchering it, and that would have been between 1432 and 1438, sorry. So it sounded as though Piero became quite aware of like Sassetto, Sassetto was on the rise, was rising up, and he worked on, it sounded as though Piero was apprenticed to and at least worked alongside Domenico Veneziano on a number of projects, but notably on the Church of Sant'Egidio in Florence, which has now since been lost. That's a recurring theme with Piero's work. A lot of it disappeared. it's very likely that Piero met Frangelico, Donatella, and Brunelleschi, and he was very informed by the classicism of Masaccio.
Brunelleschi, was he the one that designed the Duomo in Florence?
I think so, yes.
So he's the mathematical geometry influence. Donatello's the sculpture,
Yes, yeah.
like the, usually if it's wood, it might be Donatello.
Yeah.
Wood in that period, I guess.
Yeah.
And then, what was the other one?
Frangelico, yeah.
Another Florentine.
Yeah, the Brunelleschi, that Duomo is the one with the most substantial one in Florence. That's one of the biggest ones.
The main Duomo.
Yeah, the main Duomo, yeah. And that is a very impressive one. I didn't go up into it, but I was quite taken by the floor, like the tiled mosaic floors.
I went to see the Vasari inside the Duomo. Because he painted the interior of the Duomo. That's like his most famous.
Giorgio?
Oui.
Did he?
Yeah, and then I went to the museum behind the Duomo where they have the original Ghiberti doors and the wooden Donatello of the John the Baptist. And
didn't see that.
Very nice Della Robbias.
What was the Vasari like? The painting of Vasari and the Duomo?
True to form. I think there's some Vasari interiors. I remember watching a program on the history of the, oh my goodness, name is escaping me, rulers of Florence for years and years and years. What were they? Medici, yes. History of Medici. I think there's some Vasario wall paintings in a Medici palace somewhere, but the most famous is the Duomo one. And in general, Vasari is not considered to be a great painter.
Yeah, I don't think he's great. I mean, yeah.
No, he's better known for his writings, which are like really overtake his reputation as a painter. I think a lot of people don't even know that he painted the Duomo.
I really didn't. I had no idea. News to me. But yeah, I think the writings. It's interesting. The writing of his became almost like a compass, to navigate like that whole time. Really, like he sort of becomes like almost like a standalone figure for like who's important. Like
smart move if you're not that amazing a painter.
Yeah,
I don't know. He could never not have foreseen how massively his writings would impact everything we think we know.
No, exactly.
I mean, even now, like his opinions and what he's written are being like slowly unpicked and truth from, because he was a painter, so he was very opinionated, and a lot of it was quite judgy and gossipy and some of it wildly incorrect, but it had this huge hold and still has this huge hold on our history, which is really fascinating.
Yeah, it is. I sort of felt like for the volume, because it's a substantial volume of biographies, it's beyond a lifetime's work. I sort of wondered if he had like almost an army of folk going out and doing research for him or interviewing people for him, or like, because it just seemed so vast.
It kind of such an incredible time period as well, because he starts like prior to him. He's talking about Giotto.
Yeah.
He talks about the Giotto painting a fly on the wall and everyone trying to swat it because it looks so realistic.
Yeah, so wait, what is this? Tell me about this. The Giotto's trying to swat a fly. What is that?
So basically, just Vasari is so opinionated that in the lives of the artists, you can really easily pick apart who he liked and who he didn't like. Because if he likes them, they'll get like 4 pages, and it's really interesting, and it's like full of praise and these kind of myths. And if he didn't like them, they might get like a page, half a page, and little snipey comments as well. It's actually a good read. Like I read it when I was like 18. Bizarrely, I thought it was really important to read it. But it's Giotto. I think like my 2 main takeaways were the fly that he painted on the wall that was supposed to be so good that people kept trying to swat the fly away. And I think it was Giotto that Vasari said could paint a perfect circle, draw a perfect circle, because he was that talented. And that's interestingly echoed in the Rembrandt painting in I can never remember the name of the house that's on Hampstead Heath. Kenwood, yeah. The Rembrandt painting, I believe it's the one in Kenwood, and behind him is this perfect circle drawing on the wall, which is like supposedly Rembrandt's reference to Giotto, which is obviously a Vasari thing, and who knows if Giotto even did it. It's just very interesting, all this like layering of artists across time and the myths of Vasari, how they weave their way through it all.
Kenwood House has just taken on a whole other level for me. That's amazing. I had no idea that was like housed there. And
I think there's a Vermeer in there. I might be wrong.
Okay.
I could be very wrong, but for some reason I have it in my head that there is or was, or maybe I'm just conflating the Rembrandt.
They have a good collection. I think they have a solid collection. I haven't been up there several years, like at least pushing 8 years really. So yeah, I need to get back up to it because I can't even recall what Rembrandt they have.
I haven't been there in 10 years. I saw
it's
it.
a portrait, isn't it?
I saw the Rembrandt was on loan at the National Gallery. Saw it there.
Mm-hmm.
I have seen it at Kemp, but that was so long ago.
I've had no excuse to be missing out on Kenwood House. I've been up to Hampstead plenty this summer, so next time I go up, I'll have to be poking my nose in so I can find this circle.
I bet there's an Overmere. You're just looking for it. I'll get a text.
Needle in the haystack. You will not get a text, you'll get a very angry voice note.
It's Overmere's here.
You sent me on a wild goose chase. So yes, and Masaccio. So he was really informed by Masaccio.
Should we preface Masaccio a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. Please do. Yeah.
Just because Giotto's like...
I don't know that much about Masaccio other than I'm a fan of the paintings of his that I've seen.
Okay, so we're talking about a time period. This is my I'm digging into 18-year-old Olivia's brain, so please pardon me if I'm wrong. Giotto's like the first person, in theory, lots of paintings lost to time and all that, but the first painter who put Christ on land, in the, how Byzantine paintings it's in gold and they're floating around and very strange, figures with long necks and whatever else. And Giotto, Christ is amongst the sheep in Italy, in Italian clothing, surrounded by normal people, so that was groundbreaking, and they're beautiful paintings anyway. And then there's this huge art historical gap that we have between Giotto and Masaccio. I think it's something ridiculous, a couple of 100 years or something. Quite a substantial gap because wars, famines, etc. I'm not saying there's nothing in the middle. I'm just saying art history wise.
Of course, big jump, yeah. Or because they're notable events. It's notable.
So then it's Masaccio, and Masaccio, the Adam and Eve and the Brancacci Chapel. Real people, that wailing Eve looking very naked and in pain and miserable and very human on earth, these otherworldly stories being told in this very translatable, understandable, and we think about what it must have been like for Italians at the time to encounter works like that had that really amazingly sort of human feel to them. And then yes, loads of later Italian artists came and see this work in the Brancacci Chapel in Florence, the Florentine artists. And it all threads through. So there's in the Brancacci Chapel, there's also Ghirlandaio, who taught, I believe, Leonardo and Botticelli. So it's just this hub. And Masaccio has this influence to Florentine artists that just keeps rolling. So for someone to say, oh, Piero was influenced by Masaccio, it's in my head they're queuing up. That's my wild overview.
I love that. That's great. Yeah, I need to look more. More into Masaccio. I think I was reading about Masaccio and Piero recently in sort of series of essays by Philip Guston, and he's sort of obsessed with both of them and sort of drew a lot from them and travelled from New York basically to visit a lot of their frescoes and work in general. So I need to do.
There is that lovely, not lovely, but there's that skeleton which I think is in the Brancacci Chapel. It's a skeleton in a tomb underneath one of the scenes, and it says something along the lines of "What you are, I once was. What I am, you will become." Very kind of ominous and.
I quite love that.
Yeah,
that's beautiful.
It's a nice little soundbite.
Yeah, great.
Masaccio soundbite.
Who knew? Piero, he was one of the he's considered one of the founders of the Italian Renaissance, and he sort of combines his knowledge of Florentine painting and has sort of Northern European Flemish influences as well feeding into the work. And as mentioned before, he had this kind of focus on mathematical precision coupled along with a form of kind of serene humanism, the geometric form in relation to perspective and foreshortening was quite a big thing within his work. Little anecdote, sort of sidebar on his actual birth name, Piero de Benedetto. He was born to Benedetto Franceschi, a tradesman, and his mother was Romana de Pierino da Monterici. I'm sure I've butchered that. Absolutely horrendous.
I feel like if we're going to butcher, we're going to really just like go full monotone.
Yeah. I can withhold. Like I'm just gonna.
It's worse when I try, and it comes out bad.
Yeah, I mean, like, I'm not gonna like avoid affecting Italian accent. I'm gonna lean in on that, and it's gonna be awful, and that I accept that. Yeah, his family, his dad says, member. I'm not sure both or one, but members of the Florentine and Tuscan, Francescan noble family. And he was named after his mother. His dad died when he was really young. Let's see where else we got. Piero's last mentioned as a painter in 1478, and he dedicates himself to mathematics and perspective, writing treatises on both. And a little bit more on the baptism of Christ. As you mentioned in your description of it, it's an arched. The top of the painting is arched, and it's probably a central panel of an altarpiece. The physical nature of the work and like the technical sort of side of it really reflects like his relationship and awareness of Domenico Veneziano's working practices and his sort of the lightness of his touch in painting. And the baptism of Christ was probably part of a polyptych. And the dove sort of flying over Christ's head is the Holy Spirit, and the dove overhead, the foreshortening it's quite, I guess it would have at the time been quite impressive, like how the dove was presented and foreshortened, and would have seemed quite believable and plausible. And the shape and form of the dove kind of reflects the clouds, and it seems quite likely that as part of an altarpiece that this the baptism of Christ would have had above the arch of the painting, above the top of the painting, they would have had another panel of God the Father, and that would have been probably been represented in a roundel above the panel. One of the main characteristics of the painting is like one of the defining characteristics of the work is like the lightness of it and the pastel tones and the pale shadows. So I think I've just been thinking about like what about Piero, like sort of like like in terms of like his influence and stuff. He's been incredibly influential in the 20th and 21st century. Really, he's sort of he's really like, I guess, in present day terms, he's very much like a painter's painter, and I think like his influence, he basically like disappeared, or like awareness of him dissipated within his lifetime, and probably like in the last 20 years of his life when he sort of dedicated his time primarily to mathematics and geometry and writing these treatises, that he's kind of forgotten slightly, and it sounded as though he was like a bit of an outsider, and that probably didn't really do him any favors like posthumously. And Giorgio Vasari, who you gave us a really wonderful overview of, was really not a very big fan of Piero. Like, he felt that Piero was hopelessly old-fashioned in comparison to Raphael and Michelangelo, a lot of his work was destroyed. As I mentioned earlier, only 22 of his paintings sort of continue to exist. A lot of them were destroyed or disappeared or went missing. So, for example, in the mid-18th century, his fresco The Resurrection in San Sepolcro was whitewashed, and his St. Augustino polyptych was cut up and dispersed soon after. There was also an exhibition, I think, in like 2013 of like Piero della Francesca in America, and it was like there were 7 paintings in the show, so it's like such a
the Duke and Duchess of Benin. That's like a famous one in the National Gallery, there, isn't it?
That one, that's in the Uffizi.
Oh, I've been there, that's why I'm
putting
them all in the same pot.
But I think, I've seen, the reproductions of that were like everywhere, and it's such a prominent image. It almost it's almost quite a comical pairing of man and wife.
Well, I think with like today's perspective on it, it does seem quite strange. There's a lot of like questions over it, I guess, when you first see it and you don't know the sort of the ins and outs of it, the story of it. Because like, well, when I first saw it, I was like, why does his wife have such a massive forehead? And it transpired that they would like shave their foreheads because it was like fashionable to have a giant big white forehead. So the women would like.
Are you kidding me?
I don't know. I
Really?
mean, we are again digging into 18-year-old Olivia's art history A level. But
This
I
is
believe
incredible.
That's
This is incredible. You're telling me she's literally shaving her.
Well, she's not the only one in Italian painting that I see with like the big old.
Wow.
Apparently that was the thing. I might be very wrong. I'd like to caveat that. Very old
I'm
information.
sure. I mean,
I'm not going to say how many years ago that was, but it was some time. And then the other thing was he's got a big old chunk missing from his nose.
Yeah.
The Duke of Urbino, like the top of it, the bridge of his nose, the top of it is like missing.
I thought that was just that his nose was big on the bottom half. I thought it was just bottom heavy. I thought he had a really huge
he's lost
nose.
the chunk because he lost his eye and then the top of his nose in a chunk in a joust.
Right.
So you'd think, why would he choose to paint it from that angle? He's missing a chunk of his nose. Why would you highlight the nose? And then it transpires. If he turns his head, it's even worse. There's like a whole eye.
Horrendously
like,
named.
Yeah, I think there's we were looking earlier. And I think I found there's a reconstruction of his head, like what it would have looked like.
Yeah.
And it looked pretty gnarly.
Yeah, that reconstruction of the head was grisly. The stuff of nightmares.
Yeah, so so you look at the painting and you're like, why would you paint with a massive forehead? Why would you paint him from the side view when he's missing a chunk of nose? And there's like all these sort of like, it makes it a strange painting when in reality there's a lot of like reasoning behind all of these decisions.
I can't remember what's on the backside. I feel like the backside is probably painted as well because they sit in the middle of the room in the Uffizi, and they're separate panels, and if memory serves me correctly, they're kind of like on, they're sort of suspended and encased in wood, so they're sort of like on separate panels, and you can see the back of them. But I just for the life of me can't remember what's on the other side of it. But I feel like they were painted too. Just can't remember. The image is escaping me. So yeah, some more thoughts on it. I was really so I basically was just I've got a little tiny bit of some light notes on just the nature of Piero's painting on the whole, because I've been thinking about his work, thinking about like in terms of influence, because he is exceptionally prominent. You know, he's such a prominent, influential figure, and I was really trying to get to like, as I said earlier, like in terms of research, like there's a lot there. Okay, so in terms of like research, there's a lot of information out there on him, but most of the information was really kind of like he made this painting and he made this painting and he travelled here and he travelled there, and there was
a lot of that thing is like if they didn't write letters, and if Vasari didn't write about them, and if they didn't, receive lots of commissions, then we don't have the source. Particularly in that time period, that's like some of the main sources of information.
100%, and then also coupled up with a lot of work disappearing, or getting actually actively destroyed. But I was trying to think like what it is about his work, like why, like what is it about Piero that like really resonates with people in this, 20th, 21st century? Because I feel like in terms of like at least painters, I feel like art historians are like really people love Piero, and I think like he is a very big place in the heart of like painters but also historians, so I was really trying to figure out like what it was, what's like what some of the key sort of contributing factors of like his influence, and I think I'll go about that just by like reading out like my thoughts on that, and then also like thinking about like the influence on someone like Philip Guston, and I think that's interesting because I feel like Philip Guston's influence kind of speaks to like everyone else's influence right now as well, because I feel like a lot of people look at Piero, or at least painters now are like looking at Piero through the lens of Philip Guston or something. So, but yeah, on Piero's work across the board on the whole, there's sort of like a clarity and a lightness to the imagery. There's sort of a crystalline kind of quality. It's very crisp and fresh and airy, and he sort of like transitions and moves between realism, like in this kind of having like a strange dreamlike quality to space and figures, and in present day terms, like a lot of the draw to his work is a kind of painterliness. There's an economy to the application of paint, and the description and detail all feels very restrained and never excessive or like indulgent. So it all just kind of feels like quite stripped back and the bare minimum. Like he's working with like the essence of things. And he works with tempera often on panel, and he always retains like sort of like this kind of like total harmony like within the composition and in the execution of like the rendering and representation. Like there's like a totality to the subject and the narrative, and like also just to like the actual breathability of the paintings. They all have this kind of like harmony, really, like, and that harmony is sort of across the board. And he's quite a distinct and unique manner of like portraying people. Like there is a real poetry in like his consideration of like human presence, and the people in like the portraits in his work, really, like the people seem and feel very real. They feel plausible and believable, as models from and of today, and they're all very specific, and the people that are included in the painting feel very grounded in reality, but in the context of the work, the figures and the portraits also kind of feel like they have this kind of like timeless archetypal kind of quality to it. And I think that's kind of what I was thinking about with the work, is that there is this sort of like dreamlike quality to it, and obviously like with something like the resurrection, there's just a peculiarity to that, and a lot of the portraits, like the Madonna del Pardo, like that's both simultaneously very theatrical, but really a kind of oddness in the portraiture. So there's this kind of like self-awareness in terms of like the design of the space and the real like the human element in the portraits. And I just wanted to see if there was any other ones that I'd sort of been thinking about, maybe like the big battle scene, so like the battle between Heracles and Croesus. Just such a like this battle scene that he made, like it's so accomplished, and it's such a vast, complicated composition of all of these bodies and all of his action. And again, like he still manages to retain this like harmony, and like it is busy, but there is an order to it. And
I can understand the appeal of the aesthetic qualities of Piero, but I would debate what you're saying about the human aspect and the realism aspect, because if you're thinking about him in terms of his contemporaries, and those like mother and child paintings that Raphael's so well known for, with that sort of strong maternal bond to them, that really human empathy and love. I don't see that so deeply in Piero. I see the more theatrical, the staged. It feels, I don't know, that's my opinion, but if I put it in context, then I would potentially disagree a little. It doesn't mean I don't appreciate the work, but I just I don't see the realism and the human element. They seem quite surreal to me, and quite almost like cutouts.
Yeah, I do feel like there is that kind of like cutout quality to things within them, which sort of makes me think of Bellini as well. But I think in the portraits, I think maybe like not like a realism, and like Raphael's kind of realism feels a lot different to this kind of like realism. I think it was more about like sort of like level of specificity or something to the portraits that I was kind of thinking about. That I don't know. Yeah, maybe it's just there's a sort of like uncanny nature to the portraits that really makes me. That his portraits often take me off and make me wonder about them as people in their day to day, and I do think about them as models, but I can see what you mean though in terms of like the comparison to other painters working at the same time, similar time, that there's maybe some maybe feel more personal, because like that's a really early, I think that's a really early one, but like the early Virgin and Child, like that's not at all really.
No, when you think of like is it Filipino or Filippo Lippi? I can't remember. It's the father or the son, but that mother and child, when the child is like bouncing and joyful, and the mother's like smiling and holding him, like I don't question the influence of of Piero, and I don't question the like aesthetic qualities of it. I would just, those wouldn't be the adjectives I'd give it, I guess, in terms of like realism and human qualities, because I feel they feel quite surreal to me.
Yeah, I guess that's it. I think that's what I was. Yeah, they are. I think that you're right, that there is like a lot more of a surrealist bent to it, or like they are a bit. There's an unnaturalness to it as well.
But I do think that maybe is what makes it appeal.
Yeah, I think for me I maybe confuse it, maybe like mixing up like realism with like more like a specificity, to like the faces to me don't feel in any way sort of generic. Like they feel very each face feels kind of sort of specific or something. But yeah, that work, like the Madonna of Mercy, like that's a really peculiar painting, where like the underneath the cloak like opens up like all of this space, and yeah, it's often, I mean, like the imagery itself is quite dreamlike. I think in terms of like the influence on someone like Philip Guston, like I feel like the lightness of it, like in terms of like lightness of touch and lightness of tone, like the pastel quality and like the airiness and the sort of, yeah, like I sort of mentioned earlier about like the economy of it, like the nature of like the lack of description really. So like in terms of like on his little St. Jerome that lives in the Gmald Gallery, the penance of St. Jerome, like there's a real economy to like the trees and to the grass and to the sky and to the light, and everything sort of like feels kind of like one touch. Like it all feels like nothing sort of feels over described, and I think that speaks to the kind of clarity of like decision making and stuff, which I think that maybe is what sort of like has been one of the main influences on someone like Philip Guston, where it's about sort of like trying to have this kind of like fresh, light, erudite kind of handling of things, and sort of like not falling into the trap of being overly descriptive, but not necessarily just being like in inverted commas like painterly for the sake of it. But yeah, I think you're right. In terms of like other painters at the time, that like there are people that definitely have more of a kind of humanism present in the work or something, and yeah, I do think like maybe it's like in terms of like Piero sort of like transitioning from like making work in tempera for like the majority of his career, and then only sort of like coming towards like oil maybe like fairly late on by comparison, and like it wasn't kind of like something that he explored quite as much. But yeah, just come across that one, the stigmatization of St. Francis, like that's a stunning little painting. I mean, yeah. Anyway, I could go on and on about Piero, but I won't, and I think that's probably a fine point to